Celebrities are often placed on a pedestal, seen as otherworldly beings, much higher than you or I. We create these parasocial relationships with them, where we feel like we really know them, and in some way, they know us as well. But if there is one thing that connects us to not only celebrities, but to every other person in history, alive or dead, that is summed up perfectly with this clip.
You might be a king or a little street sweeper, but sooner or later you dance with the Reaper.
If you know your history, you'll know that it was a plane crash that ended the lives of Buddy Holly, Richie Valens, and the Big Bopper. But, sadly, they weren't the only members of the musicians who perished in a plane crash club. In fact, it's a club with quite a few members. During World War II, when spirits were understandably down, Americans could rely on a pick-me-up by means of the music of Glenn Miller and his orchestra. His claim to fame was being the king of swing. In the late 1930s, Miller topped the charts with such classics as By the early 1940s, the Glenn Miller Orchestra was the #1 dance band in the United States. Given that it was during World War II, it should come as no surprise that one by one his orchestra members were taken by the draft. The very draft that Glenn himself was too old to be a part of. However, that wouldn't deter him from joining the war effort. He became the leader of the U.S. Army Air Force Band, and on December 15, 1954, Miller, then stationed in England, boarded a single-engine UC-64 en route to Paris, which had been liberated by Allied forces in August. Miller was scheduled to make arrangements for moving his band to the French capital. However, his plane never arrived. While wreckage and bodies have never been recovered, it's likely that Miller's plane went down in icy conditions over the English Channel. Known for timeless classics like
I'm crazy for feeling so lonely.
Patsy Cline was one of the first country stars to cross over to pop music. On March 5, 1963, at approximately 6:07 p.m., Cline and fellow country music stars Hawkshaw Hawkins and Cowboy Copas boarded a single-engine Piper Comanche piloted by Cline's manager, Randy Hughes. After flying from a benefit performance in Kansas City, they made a brief stop at Dyersburg Municipal Airport in Dyersburg, Tennessee. Hughes was anxious to get Cline, Copas, and Hawkins back to Nashville despite multiple warnings about the weather. Minutes after takeoff, Hughes, an inexperienced pilot without instrument training, inadvertently put the plane into a deadly spiral over a forested area near Camden, Tennessee. All on board were killed instantly. Otis Redding was known for his soulful voice and influence on the history of R&B with songs like
Sitting on the dock of the bay, wasting time. Try just a little bit of tenderness.
Just before Redding was about to show the world he was truly something special, the singer and 4 members of the R&B group the Bar-Kays died when their plane crashed into Wisconsin's Lake Monona on December 10, 1967. No clear determination as to what caused the accident was ever determined. Jim Croce was the gold standard for 1970s singer-songwriters with massive hits like
Operator, could you help me place this car? If I could save time in a bottle.
There was no doubt that Croce was a superstar, but life on the road put a serious strain on his marriage, so he decided to concentrate on his family. And after one more tour, he planned to leave touring for good. On December 20th, 1973, he played his final concert in Natchitoches, Louisiana. After the show, he boarded a chartered Beechcraft E-18S bound for Texas. On takeoff, the plane failed to gain altitude and slammed into a row of trees. There were no survivors. An investigation alludes to the idea that the pilot may have suffered a heart attack that led to the accident. Lynyrd Skynyrd was one of the biggest groups of the 1970s. Fronted by singer Ronnie Van Zant, the band rocked as hard as any other rock band of the decade, with hit singles like
Sweet Home Alabama. Tuesday's gone with the wind.
On October 20th, 1977, the band departed from a show in Greensville, South Carolina for Baton Rouge, Louisiana, on their chartered Convair CV-240 airliner. Just shy of its destination, the plane crashed into a heavily wooded swamp near Gillsburg, Mississippi. Final radio contact from the pilots indicated that the plane was out of fuel. Ronnie Van Zant, guitarist Steve Gaines, and backup singer Cassie Gaines, as well as both pilots and the band's assistant road manager, were killed instantly. John Denver was a music phenomenon in the 1970s. 1970s. Truly a pioneer as a singer-songwriter, he moves seamlessly between folk, country, and soft rock with hits like
Rocking down the high Colorado country roads, take me home.
On October 12, 1997, the 53-year-old Denver was piloting his two-seater Rutan Long Easy over California's Monterey Bay. He crashed the home-built experimental plane when he was unable to execute a fuel tank switch. As reported by the Los Angeles Times, the fragile aircraft broke apart violently on impact with the water. Aaliyah was no doubt the queen of R&B in the late 90s, with hits like but her reign was very short-lived. She had just finished shooting a video for her upcoming single, Rock the Boat, from her self-titled third album on location in the Bahamas on August 25, 2001. She, along with her entourage, had chartered a twin-engine Cessna 402B for their return flight to the States. Slightly smaller than the plane they arrived in, the 402B nevertheless seemed large enough to accommodate Aaliyah's crew and luggage. Over the protests of the pilot and baggage handler, Aaliyah and the crew steadfastly insisted on taking off, despite the plane being overloaded by hundreds of pounds. According to eyewitnesses, the plane rose to an altitude of somewhere between 60 to 100 feet before violently pitching forward and crashing 200 feet from the runway. All 9 passengers died, suffering severe head trauma and burns. Aaliyah was killed instantly. She was 22. And when it comes to this week's episode, we take a look into the life of another singer snuffed out in their 20s, the Big Bopper, and his hit song, Chantilly Lace. Hello, and welcome on back to Heard It in a Love Song, the show where we take a trip to the past to discover the history of a love song we all know and love. My name is Richard Hunt, and this week, in the finale of
The day the music died,
we are taking a look into the life of the Big Bopper, as well as wrapping up the tale of just what it was that happened on the Winter Dance Party Tour.
We take you to France because that's the place where they have all the beautiful women, the wonderful perfume, the Chantilly lace, and the Big Bopper.
We start our story on October 24th, 1930, in Sabine Pass, Texas, right on the Texas-Louisiana borderline. That is where and when we meet up with Giles Perry Richardson, a worker in an oil field, and his wife, Elise Dalsby, as these two were eagerly awaiting the birth of their first son, Giles Perry Richardson Jr., future older brother to Cecil and James. The family wouldn't stay in Sabine Pass for long, as they made their way about 40 miles north to Beaumont, Texas. Giles P. Richardson, who grew up with the nickname Jape due to his first 2 initials, or just Giles, when he was the Little Bopper, was taught to play the guitar and piano by his mother, prompting a love of music that would evolve over time, eventually leading him to join the choir at Beaumont High School. Before graduating Beaumont High School, he also played as a defensive lineman for the Royal Purple football team, donning the number 85. After graduating, he set his sights on becoming a lawyer, enrolling in courses for pre-law at Lamar College. It was also at Lamar that he would become a member of the band and the choir. While studying at Lamar, he found work by means of working part-time at the Beaumont, Texas radio station KTRM, now KZZB. He also began writing some songs, many of which reflected the loss of his high school love, whose parents warned her away from him. Fearful of his music aspirations, they steered her into the arms of a local jewelry store assistant manager, whose prospects appeared to be brighter. In 1949, he was hired full-time at KTRM and decided to put his academic career on hold. It was also around this time that his broken heart was mended, as he met and fell in love with Adrienne Joy Frayu, nicknamed Tsitsi, because her father said she was no bigger than a tsetse fly. The two were wed on April 18th, 1952, and sometime in early 1953, he was promoted to supervisor of announcers at KTRM. On December 21st, 1953, Jape and Tsitsi had their first child, a baby girl named Deborah Joy. In 1955, the Vietnam War began, and Jape, much like many other young men at this time, found himself drafted into the Army. He had his basic training at Fort Ord, California, after which he spent the rest of his 2-year service as a radar instructor for Fort Bliss in El Paso, Texas. Upon his discharge at the rank of corporal in March 1957, Jape returned to KTRM radio, where he held down the Dishwasher's Serenade shift from 11 a.m. to 12:30 p.m., Monday through Friday. One of the station's sponsors wanted him for a new time slot and suggested a gimmick for the show. With Jape noticing all the college kids doing a dance called the bop, he decided to become known as the Big Bopper.
This is the Big Bopper knockin'!
He kicked off the new radio show from 3 to 6 p.m., and soon the Big Bopper became the station's program director. As a DJ, the Bopper's kitschy radio antics included a sleepless discathon in 1957. The discathon was a popular gimmick that found a station DJ staying awake and on the air for as many days as possible, while playing record after record until he collapsed from exhaustion. Curious onlookers would rush to the studio to watch the DJ and silently wonder how long he could keep it up until he passed out. After setting a new record of playing 1,821 records over 122 hours and 8 minutes, just over 5 days, without sleep and constantly being on the air, he was carried out of the station by an ambulance. During the sleepless marathon, he had begun to hallucinate, and in one hallucination, he told of foreseeing his own death, later reporting that the other side wasn't that bad. Around this time, he had begun taking his own music more seriously and started writing more songs. He wrote White Lightning, which became the first #1 country hit for George Jones in 1957.
White lightning.
Appearing at number 73 on the pop charts. And he also wrote Running Bear for his friend from Port Arthur, Texas, Johnny Preston.
Running Bear, love little white dove.
He sang background on Running Bear, but it wasn't released until September 1959 after his death. Within several months, it went to number 1. The man who launched the Big Bopper into a full-fledged recording artist versus solely a songwriter was Harold Pappy Daly from Houston. Daly was promotion director for Mercury and Starday Records, and signed Jape to Mercury. Mercury was a huge deal, and would remain so until the label folded into Def Jam, with artists like Paula Abdul, Tori Amos, Aqua, Babyface, The Bee Gees, Bon Jovi, Cameo, Cinderella, Def Leppard, Dio, Peter Gabriel, Gautier, Ariana Grande, Icona Pop, The Killers, Jerry Lee Lewis,
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
the Marshall Tucker Band, of which this show takes its name from, Lionel Richie, Rihanna, Rush, Thin Lizzy, Utada, and Kanye West. The Big Bopper's first single was Beggar to a King, a country ballady type love song which failed to gain any chart action.
Change the beggar into a king.
He soon after cut Chantilly Lace, but more on that later. In November 1958, he scored a second hit, a novelty tune titled The Big Bopper's Wedding, in which he pretends to be getting cold feet at the altar. The success of Chantilly Lace propelled him into a performing career where he hoped to earn enough money to buy a radio station in Colorado in order to support his young family, which would soon be adding another member, as Titi was around a half a year pregnant with their son Jay. However, he would never have a chance to see his family or career blossom, as he took some time off from KTRM to join Buddy Holly and the Crickets, Richie Valens, and Dion on the Belmonts for the Winter Dance Party Tour. The 1959 tour began in Milwaukee, Wisconsin on January 23rd, with a total of 24 scheduled events. The amount of travel required would prove to be detrimental to not only the physical, but the mental health of the performers as well. The distances between venues had not been considered at all when the performances were scheduled. Instead of circling around the Midwest through a series of venues in close proximity to one another in a way that made any sense, the tour hopped back and forth across the region with distances between shows sometimes exceeding 400 miles.
It makes no damn sense. Compels me, though.
As there were no true off days, the bandits had to travel most of the day, frequently for 10 to 12 hours in freezing midwinter temperatures. Most of the interstate highway system had not been built yet, so the routes between tour stops required far more driving time on narrow, two-lane rural highways than on modern expressways. General Artists Corp., GAC, the organization that booked the tour, later received considerable and understandable criticism for their total disregard for the conditions that they forced the touring musicians to endure, with Buddy Holly historian Bill Griggs saying, "They didn't care. It was like they threw darts at a map. The Tour from Hell. That's what they named it. And it's not a bad name." The tour started in Milwaukee on Friday, January 23rd, 1959. It then zigzagged during the next 11 days from Wisconsin to Minnesota, to Wisconsin to Minnesota, to Iowa to Minnesota, to Wisconsin to Iowa to Minnesota. The entire company of musicians traveled together in one bus, although the buses used for the tour were wholly inadequate, breaking down and being replaced frequently. Griggs estimated that they used about 5 different buses in the first 11 days of the tour, with no road crew there to assist the the musicians, the artists themselves were responsible for loading and unloading equipment at each stop. Adding to the shit show, the buses were not equipped for the harsh weather, which consisted of waist-deep snow in several areas and varying temperatures from 20 degrees Fahrenheit, -7 Celsius, to as low as -36 Fahrenheit, or -38 Celsius. On Saturday, January 31st, 1959, the bus full of rising stars headed across St. Louis Bay into the frigid Wisconsin night. They were coming from Duluth, Minnesota, and doing some research. The weather that night was -6 degrees Fahrenheit. With Buddy Holly and the Big Bopper hailing from Texas, and Richie Valens from California, they were definitely out of their element. On board the bus were some very worn-out, freezing, rightfully angry rock and rollers and their tour manager. The Winter Dance Party Tour had just finished its 9th show and was headed east for shows 10 and 11 at Appleton and Green Bay, respectively. But as the temperature plunged to around 30 below and the winds howled, fate stepped in. The southbound bus ground to a stop as it struggled up an incline on Highway 51, about 10 miles south of Hurley, Wisconsin. They had been on the road at that point for a little over 2 hours. 2 hours into a 6+ hour journey. Buddy Holly, the Big Bopper, Richie Valens, Waylon Jennings, Dion, and the others were stranded on a remote highway in the northern Wisconsin forest. Tommy Alsop, the Cricket's lead guitarist, recalled what happened that night. "We had started up this incline. It was snowing real bad, and the bus just started going slower and slower, and the lights got dimmer and dimmer, and all of a sudden the bus stopped. The driver said, 'The bus is frozen.' It was so cold and we were just sitting there right in the middle of the road. Everyone started thinking we were about to freeze to death." Dion's Belmonts started lighting newspapers to generate warmth. Holly's drummer Carl Bunch was in pain and having difficulty moving his legs. And when Tommy Alsop looked down, Carl's legs had turned brown from frostbite. At that moment, they saw headlights in the distance. A sheriff's deputy, who had been alerted by a passing trucker, realized how dire the situation was, and got 4 cars to take the musicians to Hurley. He also had Carl Bunch taken to the hospital in nearby Ironwood, Michigan, where he would be when he learned about the plane crash 2 days later. The rest of the men split up, with some of them ending up at Club Carnival in Hurley to get something to eat, and some at a hotel in Ironwood to get a short night's rest. The next day, they headed to Green Bay by train and by Greyhound bus. The Appleton show was canceled. Monday, February 2nd was supposed to be an off day, but at the last moment, tour organizers realized what that meant for their pockets and contacted Carol Anderson, the manager of the Clear Lake, Iowa venue, the Surf Ballroom, to offer him their tour. He accepted, of course, altering history forever. The admission for the show was $1.25. With inflation, that comes out to about $12 as of 2022. But given that it was a Monday, the concert did not sell out. The Big Bopper's Chantilly Lace closed the set that night. By this point, Holly was not keen on traveling another 400 miles after a show to their next one, which was set for Moorhead, Minnesota, and was to have been a radio performance at the station KFGO with disc jockey Charlie Boone. Buddy was out of clean clothes, and he was tired, as was the rest of the guys. So he arranged to have a small charter plane take him and his band to Fargo, North Dakota, which is adjacent to Moorhead. The rest of the party would have picked him up in Moorhead, saving him the journey in the bus and leaving him time to get some rest. Fate again would intervene. While Buddy Holly's plans were to have him, Tommy Alsop, and Waylon Jennings take that plane to Fargo, fate had other plans. Both Richie Valens and the Big Bopper were unsurprisingly sick, and that played into what happened next in a big way. When Richie asked Tommy for his seat, they decided the best way to decide who got the seat was a coin toss. Bob Hale, a disc jockey with Mason City's KRIB AM, was emceeing the concert that night, and he flipped a coin in the ballroom's side stage room shortly before the musicians departed for the airport. Valens won the coin toss for the seat on the flight by calling heads, and he was reportedly remarked as saying, "That's the first time I've ever won anything in my life." Of course, like many of these huge events in music history, there are various tales of what actually happened with that coin toss. Tommy Alsop argues that Hale was not even present at the coin flip. Dion DiMucci of Dion and the Belmonts says that it was Alsop that wasn't involved in the coin toss. According to Dion's website, Dion was, in fact, scheduled to fly in that fateful plane that went down. The headliners flipped a coin to see who was going to fly. The Big Bopper and Dion won the toss. Then he discovered that the flight would cost $36. The exact amount of rent his parents paid monthly. He said, "I couldn't bring myself to pay a full month's rent on a short flight. So I said, 'Richie, you go.' He accepted and took my seat. Only the 4 of us knew who was getting on the flight when we left the dressing room that night. Of those 4, I was the only one who survived, beyond February 3rd, 1959. Tommy Alsop has threatened to whoop Dion's ass for claiming he participated in the coin toss with Richie Valens.
Don't try to figure out who it is. Give you a little clue. I'll give you a clue. He had a group called the Belmonts. I'm going to kill him if I see him. If I ever get him in from behind his computer and get his butt out here in Clear Lake, Shane said he'd put a boxing ring up here, and I'll spot him 10 years. I'll whip his ass right here on the stage.
Larry Lemur's book, The Day the Music Died, quotes Carol Anderson, the manager of the Surf Ballroom, and the person who first contacted the pilot, Roger Peterson, as saying that Holly said he wanted to get a flight for him and his band. Anyway you cut it, Richie Valens made it onto the plane that night. As for the Big Bopper, well, Waylon Jennings, seeing how sick he was, offered up his seat to good old Japes, prompting a snide but loving little back and forth between Waylon and Buddy. According to Jennings' memoir, Waylon, an autobiography, Holly told him that, "I hope your damn bus freezes up again," with Jennings replying, "Well, I hope your own plane crashes." This casual remark haunted Jennings for years. "I was so afraid for years that somebody was going to find out what I said," he told CMT in 1999. "Somehow I blamed myself. Compounding that was the guilty feeling I was still alive. I hadn't contributed anything to the world at that time compared to Buddy. Why would he die and not me? It took a long time to figure that out, and it brought about some big changes in my life, the way I thought about things." Carol Anderson called Hubert Jerry Dwyer, the owner of Dwyer Flying Services in Mason City, Iowa, to charter the plane to Fargo's Hector Airport, the closest one to Moorhead, Minnesota. Flight arrangements were made with Roger Peterson, a local pilot described as a young married man who built his life around flying. Peterson was only 21 years old when he agreed to fly the musicians to Fargo for $36 apiece. With inflation, that's about $350 in 2022. The plane in question was a 1947 single-engined V-tailed Beechcraft 35 Bonanza with a registration number of N3794N, which seated 3 passengers and the pilot. The weather at the time of the departure, around 1 a.m. Central Time, was reported as light snow with a visibility of 6 miles, 10 kilometers, and winds from 20 to 30 miles per hour, 32 to 48 kilometers per hour. Although deteriorating weather was reported along the route, the weather briefings that Peterson received failed to relay that information. Peterson, having not been informed of worsening weather conditions, decided to fly on instruments, which means flying without visual confirmation of the horizon, which led to the crash. An investigation of the crash determined the flight was ill-advised and was caused by poor weather conditions and pilot error. It was discovered that the pilot was not certified to fly by instruments only. Buddy's brother, Larry Holly, said, "I got the full report from Civil Aeronautics. It took me a year to get it, but I got it." And they had installed a new Sperry gyroscope in the airplane. The Sperry works different than any other gyro. One of them, the background moves and the plane stays stationary, and in the other one, the background stays steady and the plane moves. It just works backwards. He could have been reading this backwards. They were going down, and he thought they were still climbing. The Bonanza had impacted terrain at high speed, estimated to have been around 170 miles per hour, 270 kilometers per hour, banking steeply to the right and at a nose-down altitude. The right wingtip had struck the ground first, sending the aircraft cartwheeling across the frozen field for 450 feet, before coming to rest against a wire fence at the edge of a cornfield belonging to Albert Jewell. The plane had made it 6 miles before crashing, killing all 4 passengers immediately. With the rest of the entourage en route to Minnesota, Anderson, who had driven the party to the airport and witnessed the plane's takeoff, had to identify the bodies of the musicians. County Coroner Ralph Smiley certified that all 4 victims died instantly, citing the cause of death as gross trauma to the brain for the 3 artists and brain damage for the pilot. Richie Valens was 17, Buddy Holly was 22, and the Big Bopper was 28.
And the 3 men I admire most, the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost.
Buddy Holly's pregnant wife, Maria Elena, found out about his death from TV reports. A widow after just 6 months of marriage, she suffered a miscarriage soon after, apparently due to psychological trauma. Holly's mother, who heard the news on the radio in Lubbock, Texas, screamed and collapsed. The incident was responsible for authorities adopting specific protocols for notifying family members of their loved one's death before the media. His funeral was held on February 7, 1959 at the Tabernacle Baptist Church in Lubbock. The service was officiated by Ben D. Johnson, who presided at the Holly's wedding just months earlier. The pallbearers were Jerry Allison, Joe B. Malden, Nikki Sullivan, Bob Montgomery, and Sonny Curtis. Some sources say that Phil Everly, one half of the Everly brothers, was also a pallbearer, but he said at one point that he attended the funeral, but not as a pallbearer. Waylon Jennings was unable to attend because of his commitment to the still touring Winter Dance Party. Waylon Jennings and Tommy Alsip continued on, with Jennings taking Holly's place as lead singer, and other artists were added, like Frankie Avalon and Bobby V. His headstone carries the correct spelling of his name, Holley, and a carving of his Fender Stratocaster guitar. Maria did not attend his funeral and has never visited the gravesite, later telling the Avalanche Journal, "In a way, I blame myself. I was not feeling well when he left. I was 2 weeks pregnant, and I wanted Buddy to stay with me, but he had scheduled that tour. It was the only time I wasn't with him, and I blame myself, because I know that, if only I had gone along, Buddy would have never gotten on that airplane." Tootsie, who hated Jake being on the road, particularly disliked him going off on the Winter Dance Party Tour in 1959, and she was proved right in her distaste for the road. She was 6 months pregnant when she received word of his death. Devastated by the loss of her husband she adored, the young mother blamed the music industry and avoided any connection with it during the decades after his death. Only 20 of his songs remain. His body was flown back to Beaumont by private plane, and after his funeral, the streets were lined with fans watching the long procession of cars moving to the cemetery. Giles Perry Richardson was interred in the Beaumont Cemetery on February 5, 1959. His son, J.P. Richardson, took up a musical career inspired by his late father and was known professionally as the Big Bopper Jr., even performing at venues around the world. Notably, he toured on the Winter Dance Party Tour with a Buddy Holly impersonator, John Moeller, on some of the very same stages as his father. In January 2007, Jay requested that his father's body be exhumed and an autopsy be performed to settle the rumors that a gun was fired or that Richardson initially survived the crash. The autopsy was performed by Dr. Bill Bass, a forensic anthropologist at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. Jay was present with Dr. Bass throughout the autopsy and observed as the casket was opened. Both men were surprised to find that the remains were well enough preserved to be recognizable as the late rock star. Dr. Bass's findings indicated that there were no signs of foul play. He was quoted as saying, "There are fractures from head to toe. He died immediately. He didn't crawl away. He didn't walk away from the plane at all." J.P. Richardson himself passed away in 2013. On February 7, 1959, Ritchie Valens' body was taken from the Noble Chapel Funeral Home in San Fernando Valley to San Fernando Mission Cemetery. His body was driven in a copper-colored hearse. Donna remembers that she received more than 8,000 letters after a fan magazine printed her address, and Elvis Presley, whom she had never met, had one of his bodyguards arrange a date with her so that he could ask all about Valens. Ken Paquette, a Wisconsin fan of the 1950s era, erected a stainless steel monument depicting a steel guitar and the set of 3 records bearing the names of each of the 3 performers. Along with that memorial is a giant pair of Buddy Holly's glasses. Despite Holly and Valens both being inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, the Big Bopper has yet to get in, which is not surprising as he is often left out of the bigger picture. Buddy Holly has a biopic, the aptly titled The Buddy Holly Story, starring Gary Busey as Buddy Holly, and Ritchie Valens has a biopic entitled La Bamba, starring Lou Diamond Phillips, both of which do feature the Big Bopper at the end, but as of 2022, there is no tried and true Big Bopper biopic. That isn't to say he wasn't as influential, as the Big Bopper is often cited as being the first musician to have music videos. Buddy Holly was extremely influential on many artists. John Lennon and Paul McCartney saw Holly for the first time when he appeared on Sunday night at the London Palladium. The two had recently met and began their musical association. They studied Holly's records, learned his performance style and lyricism, and based their act around his persona. Inspired by Holly's insect-themed band The Crickets, they chose to name their band The Beatles. On January 31st, 1959, 2 nights before Buddy Holly's death, 17-year-old Bob Dylan attended Holly's performance in Duluth. Dylan referred to this in his acceptance speech when he received the Grammy Award for Album of the Year for Time Out of Mind in 1998.
And I just wanted to say that one time when I was about 16 or 17 years old, I went to see Buddy Holly play at in Duluth National Guard Armory, and I was 3 feet away from him. And he looked at me, and I just have some kind of feeling that he was, I don't know how or why, but I know he was with us all the time we were making this record in some kind of way.
Elton John was musically influenced by Holly, and at age 13, although he did not require them, he started wearing horn-rimmed glasses to imitate Holly. In an August 24, 1978 interview with Rolling Stone, Bruce Springsteen told Dave Marsh, "I play Buddy Holly every night before I go on. That keeps me honest." And Ritchie Valens is widely accepted to be the godfather of Chicano pop, being blended into the American mainstream. Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and the Big Bopper are immortalized in the 1971 Don McLean classic, American Pie. But let's take it back to this week's topic, the story of Chantilly Lace.
Make me feel real loose like a long neck
Originally called That's What I Like, Chantilly Lace was released as a B-side for another song, The Purple People Eater Meets the Witch Doctor, and while the A-side got some airplay, the Chantilly Lace B-side eventually took off, becoming one of the most played songs of 1958. According to Bill Griggs, editor of the Rocking 50s music magazine, the Big Bopper was convinced that the music video was the wave of the future, and at the time of his death, he was preparing to start production on music videos for TV, and especially designed jukebox that would play videos. The song reached number 6 on the Billboard Hot 100 and spent 22 weeks on the national top 40. Chantilly Lace inspired an answer song performed by Jane Mansfield titled That Makes It, hypothetically based on what the girl may have been saying at the other end of the line.
Nothing in the world means more to a girl than a man who's cool, really knows how to rule.
Which is very odd to me because Jane was also involved in a tragic accident that took her life when she was only 34. Now, what the hell exactly is Chantilly Lace? Chantilly Lace fabric is a type of bobbin lace traditionally created out of black threads and featuring floral or botanical patterns on a point or net background. Its name originates from the city of Chantilly in France, where such lace concepts were firstly designed. Chantilly Lace comes in at 174 beats per minute. Writing these episodes and putting them together has been extremely difficult on my mental health. Losing just one of the three of these men at that young of an age would have been a tragedy, but all three? It's nearly unspeakable. They left their mark on the face of music forever, even if they weren't around to see that outcome. Chantilly Lace is such a fun little song. We have all had that romance that makes us drop whatever the hell it was we were doing to pay attention to them. The Big Bopper was the OG simp, and I love him for that. This week's Love Homework is another song about receiving a call from a loved one, albeit with a sadder result. Teardrops on My Telephone by Hunks and His Punks.
And now there's teardrops on my telephone.
And like I have been promising, here are my choices for the biopics. For Richie Valens, it's Adam Irigoyen. For Buddy Holly, Finn Wolfhard. And for the Big Bopper, Josh Hutcherson. And that's it, the end of another love song history lesson. If you like what you learned, and you'd like to continue learning, subscribe, hit the bell, drop a like below, and join me again next week for the history of a love song we all know and love. And it's a special one, as it's the Valentine's Day special. Until next time, remember that tomorrow is not a guarantee, so tell your loved ones you love them. And remember, you heard it in the love song.
No!